Hello, my name is the Most Reverend Shaun McCann. I currently serve as the Sovereign Pontiff and Patriarch of the Apostolic Johannite Church. This is a presentation entitled Digging Under the Temple Mount, Speculations on the Medieval Johannite Mythos. One of the reasons why I've chosen to record this presentation in this format is that when I originally did the presentation at Conclave 2016 in Boston, I ended up going about an hour and a half overtime, as I recall, and there was a lot of meandering in the middle, something to which I am prone, as the clergy and seminarians of the AJC will readily tell you. They signed up to deal with that. You didn't. So I've decided to streamline this presentation a little bit more by presenting it in this format. So, first, an overview. In other words, what are we doing, why are we doing it, and what is it going to look like? First of all, we're exploring the setting of a medieval Johannite church through the examination of the backdrop of the Order of the Temple. Why we do this, I will cover a little bit more in the first section. And then we will examine any similarities and differences between legendary accounts, the legend of the Johannite Church, and their sources. Third, we will examine the emerging picture in light of existing theories and ideas about the medieval Johannite Church and the Order of the Temple. 4, we will examine the emerging picture in light of likely antecedent and descendant or subsequent communities. And lastly, I'm going to get wild and crazy with speculation while throwing water on the entire thing, and then editing the video to increase plausible deniability. And I probably should have struck that from the slide. So, before we get into the meat of the presentation, a little bit of historical backdrop on the Order of the Temple and the history leading up to it. I'm willing to wager that most of you who are listening to or watching this presentation, you probably already know all this, but I've got to assume that there are going to be people occasionally who do not, and so it is good to give a little bit of historical context in terms of the Order of the Temple and the history immediately preceding it, and a little bit of history into it as well. So some major dates worthy of note that will be significant for some of the facts and legends and myths discussed later on. In 1054, we have the Great Schism, so-called, which was the split between the Western Church and the Eastern Church. It took what liked to call itself at the time the one only Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, Catholic as a universal, and split it into the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church. It's a little bit more complicated than that, particularly because there were groups that had split off 500 years prior and so on. But we're going to go with the shorthand for ease. This isn't a presentation on the schism, it's a presentation on the Templars and a bunch of crazy legends. So you have the Great Schism, which was just begging to happen over the course of several centuries prior, and finally reached its climax when Cardinal Humbert placed the letter of excommunication on the altar of the Hagia Sophia in the heart of the Eastern Church in Constantinople. This disagreement was, well, over power, over theology, over a great many things, and there is, in my opinion, no one single cause, but a confluence of causes building up over centuries. And eventually it boiled over in 1054 when Cardinal walked into the Hagia Sophia and planted a letter of excommunication on the altar. Pretty demanding. Functionally, the reality of the split had already been happening for some time. And the reality for on-the-ground Christians didn't necessarily change right away, though in terms of the official stances, things were firmly broken. And they only went downhill from there. particularly with the Fourth Crusade. So in 1070, we have the birth of Hugh de Payens, the future founder of the Order of the Knights of the Temple. In 1099, we have the First Crusade. This is led by Godfrey de Bouillon. This also coincides roughly with the founding of the Knights of the Holy Sepulchre, and it should be noted that Godfrey de Bouillon took the title of advocate or defender of the Holy Sepulchre rather than King of Jerusalem when Jerusalem was conquered. And of course, we also have, around that time, we have the founding of the Knights Hospitaller, though the Order of St. John, or the Order of the Hospital, was not a military order at its founding. In 1104, we have Hugh, Count of Champagne, who visits the Holy Land, likely with Hugh de Payens in tow. In 1114, we have the first reference to a militia of Christ, and this reference is by the Bishop of Chartres. So in 1118 or 1119 thereabout, you actually have the formal foundation or formation of the Order of the Temple. In 1120, at the Council of Nablus, some 20 years after the First Crusade, convened by the Patriarch Warmond of Jerusalem and Baldwin II, King of Jerusalem, they recognized the Order of the Temple in the East, in the Holy Land, for the first time. Now, it's important to note, and a lot of people kind of conflate the Crusades and the Knights Templar, and there's reason to do so, to be sure. But it is important to note that the Knights Templar did not participate in the conquering of Jerusalem in the First Crusade. They didn't exist, right? It is likely, it is almost certain that some of the early founders and members of the future Knights Templar participated in the First Crusade, but as an organization, the Knights Templar did not exist at the time of the First Crusade. That said, they would go on to play significant roles in subsequent crusades, like the Second Crusade, for example. But given that people tend to conflate through the entire history of the Crusades, I think it's important to clear that up. Now, in 1129, the Templars are recognized in the West for the first time. So 9 years after their official standing is gained in the East, they gain their standing in the West, and their rule is adopted and approved at the Council of Troyes. In 1131, we have In Praise of the New Knighthood by St. Bernard of Clairvaux. Bernard of Clairvaux was a Cistercian abbot and noted mystic who exercised considerable power and influence over the entire of Christendom, so-called. And so this document written in praise of the Knights Templar was a significant boost to their status and their legitimacy. So now we move on to the Order of the Temple in the Holy Land. In the overview, I said that we would come back and explain why we're looking at the medieval backdrop and religious life of the Order of the Temple. And as you can see in my first point of this slide, that's simply because there is no historical record of a distinct Johannite church in the Middle Ages. That has to be said up front. The legend is a legend. It is a myth. And whatever historical reality it testifies to, I don't think we're in a position where we're ever going to get evidence of it. However, that doesn't mean that it's devoid of value, spiritually, mythologically, thematically, in terms of the context of the AJC or Templarism. The legend, of course, is of great value, and that's something that we'll be exploring as we go through the presentation. I think one of the things where some modern and not so modern esoteric orders, esoteric-minded churches, and the like fall short is when they present legend or myth or so-called esoteric or traditional history as history. I don't think we should be ashamed or downplay the mythology or the legends that play a part in the modern spiritual, esoteric, and religious organizations we're in. But I do think that we should be distinct about what is history, what is fact, what is fiction, what is legend, and what is myth, and where those overlap and where those blur. So there's no historical record of a distinct Johannite church in the Middle Ages. So then how do we examine, as from the title of the presentation, how do we examine the medieval Johannite mythos, or rather the mythos of a medieval Johannite church? Well, we do this by taking a look at its closest approximation, and close here is fairly relative. The closest approximation we have to it, if the Johannite legend speaks of the Johannite church passing on its teachings, passing on its lineage, and its spiritual power and authority to the order of the temple, then the closest kind of connection or thing we can look at in terms of the order of the temple is to look at its religious and spiritual activity. So in this portion, in this slide, in the next slide or two, we're going to look at the spiritual or liturgical activity of the order of the temple. In terms of the order of the temple's rule and its regulation in terms of garb and prayer and the like, that's been kind of well attested and examined elsewhere, so I'm not going to go into that as much. This here is designed to focus on, what they did in terms of actual corporate and central worship. And in that regard, I'm going to focus on what's called the rite of the Holy Sepulchre, giving a little bit of kind of facts and backdrop to that, as that was the liturgy, or the Mass, the Divine Liturgy, the Eucharist, that the order of the temple used. So it formed kind of the central pillar of their religious practice. Now, I did make mention, of course, of examination of the legends in the overview and earlier on in this slide, and we're going to do that, but we're going to do that as a separate point of research. So here, obviously, both with the previous slides and historical backdrop, and here looking at the liturgical life or the liturgical context of the order of the temple, here we're looking at kind of the facts, what we know and what's agreed on by history and archaeology and existing texts and the like. And later on, we're going to look at the legends as an entirely separate and disconnected subject. Okay, so taking a brief look here at the rite of the Holy Sepulchre. This was the liturgy that was in use by the Order of the Temple, the Knights Templar, but it was also in use by the Order of St. John, also later to be known also as the Knights Hospitaller, and the Order of the Brothers of the Blessed Virgin Mary of Mount Carmel, known today as the Carmelites. So essentially, the rite of the Holy Sepulchre was the liturgy that was in use by the most prominent religious and military orders within the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem in the medieval era. And it's entirely Western in origin. Later on in the legends, you will see reference to doctrines of the East and rites of the East, but in terms of the actual, what we know, historical fact around the religious life of the Knights Templar, the rite of the Holy Sepulchre, their Eucharist, was made up entirely of Western material. So all liturgical material, as the point says, is that which came with the Crusaders. Essentially, it was put together through material found in liturgical texts and breviaries that the Crusaders brought with them. So noting that it's made of material that was brought by the Crusaders, that also tells you that this liturgical material predates the Knights Templar, because the Knights Templar came after the First Crusade, as mentioned earlier. Some of the sources for the material within the rite of the Holy Sepulchre include material from Evreux, Bayeux, Chartres, and York. These sources were not randomly chosen. They were very deliberate, and they were sourced from what was in circulation material-wise in Jerusalem. So it was material that was brought with them on crusade and stayed there. It wasn't material that came in later after the crusade. They essentially put it together using the material on hand that they brought with them when they came initially on crusade. So one of the reasons why they chose to use or put together, and by they I mean the religious community, the Church of the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem, one of the reasons why they used the liturgy that they did, this liturgy, of course, being the rite of the Holy Sepulchre, is that there was a language barrier that would have prevented adoption of local Greek liturgy. The Crusaders were Latin, and the established Christians within the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem, within the Holy Land, were Orthodox and Greek. So they wouldn't have been able to use their liturgy if they wanted to. And on the subject of whether or not they wanted to, they wouldn't have wanted to, simply because the Crusaders would have rejected the authority of the local Greek bishop. Not just a matter of being under the obedience of their own bishops and the Church of Rome, but also from likely from a cultural perspective as well. They tended to, at this point in time, the West tended to see the East, as being snooty and aloof, whereas the East tended to view the West as being barbarians. So the Crusaders would have rejected the authority of the local Greek bishop, and this wasn't simply just the local manifestation of biases and prejudices. This is something that would spread over the entire church. As I noted earlier, in the historical context, the historical overview, the great schism between East and West had occurred in 1054. So several generations had passed since that time. Of interest to note is that the neighboring ecclesial communities that were also Latin or became Latin by virtue of Crusader activity used a different liturgy. The Patriarch of Antioch and the Principality of Antioch used a different rite. So this rite was exclusively to my knowledge, exclusively in the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem. Now, the most likely influence for putting together the rite, based on the sources that I've mentioned, is Arnulf, who was chaplain to Duke Robert of Normandy, and the first unratified Patriarch of Jerusalem. Essentially, he stepped into the role. He would become the third canonical Patriarch of Jerusalem, however, so eventually he would be made official. And he was also the tutor to the daughter of William the Conqueror. It's amazing how many connections you have between major historical events in that fashion. Now we move on to the legends, which I'm sure is the part that you're waiting for, and admittedly is the part that I find most interesting, or at least, I find it the most relevant in the modern era of the Johannite tradition, because it's when you put these legends side by side that you begin to see the different ways in which different esoteric orders and churches that make use of it were in turn shaped by it, and what parts do they emphasize and what parts do they not. And what does that tell us about the nature of the groups themselves, and the differences between them, and most importantly, what does it tell us about ourselves with the forms of the legend that we use. So now we are going to get into the legends themselves. Now, the legends are found in 4 different places. You could probably actually more truthfully say 5 or 6 different places, but there's some overlap between these organizations and movements, so I'm combining a few of them, and I'll explain which ones and why as we go. So essentially, I've divided these up into 4 distinct blocks, so to speak, groups or movements that use these legends, though some of them overlap quite a bit, so I'll be treating them at the same time. The first and central source, of the legend in modern usage that we use, of course, comes from the Johannite Church of Primitive Christians of Bernard-Raymond fabre-palaprat. So you'll see I put in the first point the institutional narrative of the Apostolic Johannite Church and the Église primitive of Bernard-Raymond fabre-palaprat. Our version that we use in the present day has some key differences from the version that was used during the reign of Dr. fabre-palaprat, and we'll be going into some of those differences. Though in terms of looking at the actual legend itself, we're going to look at it as one unit and break it down later. So the second source or place to which the legend is to be found is within the esoteric history of Raymond Bernard, who was a French mystic, occultist, Templar practitioner, and Rosicrucian of the Amorc brand earlier on in the 21st century. And of course, the order which he would found, which is the Sovereign Order of the Initiatic Temple, or Order Souverain du Temple Initiatique. I'm butchering the French here. I'm really sorry about that. The third block we find is the Kabbalistic Order of the Rose-Croix / the Rose-Croix d'Orient, the Rose Cross of the East, which is esoteric movement that has some overlap with modern Martinism, modern Rosicrucianism, and the French occult revival in the turn of the century. And finally, the fourth block, which plays into the third block, they're interconnected, is the Order Martiniste at Sinarquique, the Martinist order in Sinarquie. So we're going to essentially look at these legends in 3 blocks as we go along, even though I've got these broken down into 4. So we're going to look at the institutional narrative of the Apostolic Johannite Church and the legendary material of fabre-palaprat's day as one unit. Then we're going to look at the esoteric history from Raymond Bernard and the Sovereign Order of the Initiatic Temple. And then in a combined effort, we're going to look at the Rose Cross of the Orient and the Order Martiniste at Sinarquique. So, first out of the gate, we have the institutional narrative, as it is known within the Apostolic Johannite Church. And in this section, we're going to be looking at the legend as it was expounded in the era of Bernard-Raymond fabre-palaprat, which essentially, there are some differences, and we'll go into it, which is essentially the overall narrative that is used in the institutional narrative of the Apostolic Johannite Church. Now, some of the people here who may be listening to or watching this presentation might be doing so through the means of our Johannite School, which is designed to give you an overview and an introduction to Johannite theology and practice, the modern Apostolic Johannite Church, and its structure. So chances are, if you're here in that context, or if you're a member of the AJC, or even somebody who has followed the activity of the AJC with any degree of interest, over any number of years, then you know that the institutional narrative is one of the central parts to our liturgy. It is the recounting of the legend, which is then followed by the Litany of Sovereign Pontiffs, where we recall the lineage of the beloved disciple as it legendarily manifests and transmits through the order of the temple within the legendary context and upwards into the present day. So there, if you've been to many liturgies from many different churches, or you're a sacramental Christian or an ecclesiastical Gnostic, you'll know that there are many things that liturgies have in common with each other. There's nothing new under the sun when it comes to Christian or even Gnostic liturgy. However, one of the things that's markedly different between our liturgy and the liturgy of other churches is the use of this institutional narrative. And now we're going to explore it in some detail. Without further delay, the Johannite legend. The Order of the East has given birth to the Order of the Temple. It is in ancient Egypt that the cradle of the Order of the East is to be found. This institution included several classes or orders of adepts. The adepts of the first order were at the same time legislators, judges, and pontiffs. Their polity opposed itself to the propagation of metaphysical knowledge and of the natural sciences, of which they preserved the deposit. And he who durst reveal to the people the secrets reserved for the initiated in the order of the sacerdotal hierarchy would have been punished with the greatest torment. They only presented to the people unintelligible emblems, which constituted the exterior theology. This theology was a compound of absurd dogmas and extravagant practices, but which tended to give more empire to superstition and to consolidate the government. Moses was initiated in Egypt. Profoundly instructed in the theological, physical, and metaphysical mysteries of the priests, he knew how to profit by it to overcome the power of the Magi and to deliver his companions. Aaron, his brother, and the chiefs of the Hebrews became depositaries of his doctrine. These chiefs, or Levites, were divided into several classes according to the custom of the Egyptian priests. The Son of God afterward appeared on the stage of the world. He was brought up at the school of Alexandria. Penetrated with a spirit all divine and endowed with the most astonishing dispositions, he knew how to attain to all the degrees of the Egyptian initiation. On his return to Jerusalem, he presented himself before the chiefs of the synagogue, and he pointed out to them the numerous alterations that the law of Moses had experienced in the hands of the Levites. He confounded them by the force of his genius and the extent of his knowledge. But the Jewish priests, blinded by their passions, persisted in the errors which were their produce and their aliment. However, the time was accomplished. Jesus Christ, directing the fruit of his lofty meditations towards the universal civilization and happiness of the world, tore away the veil which hid the truth from the people. He preached the love of God, the love of their neighbors, and the equality of all men before the common Father. Consecrating at length, by a sacrifice worthy of the Son of God, the celestial dogmas that he had transmitted, he fixed forever on the earth, with his Gospels, the religion written in the book of eternity. Jesus conferred evangelical initiation on his apostles and on his disciples. He transfused into them his spirit, divided them into several orders according to what was practiced among the Egyptian and Hebrew priests, and placed them under the authority of John, the beloved disciple, the apostle of brotherly love, whom he had instituted sovereign pontiff and patriarch. John never quitted the East. His doctrine, always pure, was never altered by the mixture of any other doctrine. Peter and the other apostles carried the dogmas of Jesus Christ amongst distant people, but were forced too often in order to propagate the faith, to conform themselves to the manners and customs of those different nations, and even to admit rites which were not those of the East. Some shades and differences glided into the different Gospels, as well as into the doctrines of the numerous Christian sects. Until about the year 1118, the mysteries in the hierarchical order of the initiation of Egypt, transmitted to the Jews by Moses, and afterwards to the Christians by Jesus Christ, were religiously preserved by the successors of John the Apostle. These mysteries and initiations, regenerated by the evangelical initiation, or baptism, were a sacred deposit, which the simplicity of the primitive manners, and always the same of the brethren of the East, had preserved from any alteration. The Christians, persecuted by the infidels, appreciating the courage and piety of those brave crusaders who, with the sword in one hand and the cross in the other, fled to the defense of the holy places, and rendering especially a brilliant justice to the virtues and ardent charity of the companions of Hugh of the pagans, thought it their duty to confide to hands so pure the treasure of the knowledge acquired during so many ages, sanctified by the cross, the dogmas, and morality of the God-man. Hugh was clothed with the apostolic patriarchal power, and was placed in the legitimate order of the successors of John the Apostle or Evangelist. Such is the origin of the foundation of the order of the Temple, and of the fusion into this order of the various modes of initiation of the Christians of the East, designated under the title Primitive Christians, or Johannites. It is to this initiation that belong the different degrees consecrated by the rules of the Temple, and of which so much has been spoken in the famous but terrible process instituted against the august order by Philip the Fair and Clement V, a process by which they wished to cause to pass for impious practices those which were only proofs, symbols, and signs of recognition, and words of rallying. Jacques de Molay, foreseeing the misfortune that menaced the order, designated for his successor Brother John Mark Larminius of Jerusalem, whom he invested with the plenitude of the apostolic patriarchal authority and with magisterial power. This late Grand Master transmitted the sovereign powers to the Brother Theobald of Alexandria, as appears by the charter of transmission that John Mark Larminius gave in 1324, a charter of which the original is preserved with the other writings not less precious, etc., in the treasure of the order of the Temple. So there you have the Johannite legend directly as it comes out of the material put together at the time of Dr. Bernard-Raymond fabre-palaprat and the Johannite Church of Primitive Christians. I read it directly as it appears, and I didn't alter any words, so you may notice things like man and men and where humanity or persons would do, and so on and so forth, as well as some more archaic language, such as aliment, which is food or sustenance. So there it is directly as it appears in the material. So to break it down for you a bit, to go and look at some of that line by line, as it were, as well with some additional context provided by the other Leviticon material. Here we go. So the legend recounts an order of the East, which originated in Egypt and consisting of several orders of adepts, essentially, adept magical and religious practitioners. And the first of these being legislators, judges, and pontiffs. And they presented two doctrines, one esoteric and one exoteric. And for me, this kind of split always reminds me of the image of the Templar seal of the two knights on one horse. Sure, that talks about the order initially being so poor that they needed two knights on one horse because they didn't have enough money. But I would like to think that the symbolism can be seen or is useful to go a little bit deeper. And one of those things that I find lines up with that is the esoteric and exoteric. So this Order of the East essentially predated the Templars. It is the root of the authority of the Templars in this legend. And it is out of this order later on that you will have, the Johannite Church, that essentially the figures of the Johannite Church and the Order of the East are implied later on to be one for one. So Moses was initiated in Egypt, and Aaron, his brother, and the chiefs of the Hebrews become depositaries of this doctrine. And these chiefs were the Levites, essentially the priestly tribe. And they were divided into classes according to the custom of the Egyptian priests. But of course, the text doesn't elaborate exactly on what these divisions are or what the specific custom of the Egyptian priests were. How convenient. Just the same, it has Jesus being raised in the school of Alexandria, Alexandria, of course, being in Egypt, and also notable as being more or less the birthplace of Gnosticism. So Jesus was raised in the school of Alexandria, and he knew how to attain to all degrees of Egyptian initiation. Jesus was aware of differences and alterations that the law of Moses had experienced in the hands of the Levites who persisted in error. It says that Christ tore away the veil which hid the truth from the people, and this presumably is the division between the esoteric and exoteric doctrine mentioned earlier on in the legend. And he preached the love of God, love of neighbor, and equality before the divine. In the modern institutional narrative, we say the common parent of all humanity. Jesus transmitted his spirit to the apostles and divided them into orders according to, quote, what was practiced among the Egyptian and Hebrew priests. And he placed them under the authority of John, the beloved disciple, now instituted as sovereign pontiff and patriarch. So it is said that John preserved the doctrine unaltered. This is what separates him out from the other apostles, and it's worth noting also that this separation out, or this distinction around John the apostle, is not only, of course, found in the legend, but it's also found in the text of the Gospels according to the primitive church. And when the legend refers to the Gospels, what they're talking about is not actually the canonical Gospels, as most people are accustomed to thinking of them, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but the Gospels according to the primitive church, what we call in shorthand the Leviticon. Now, that being said, the Leviticon is actually several sets of documents. It is the Gospels according to the primitive church, which is a different version or account of the Gospel of John, and its commentary on it, as well as rules and ritual practices and statutes for the governance of the Johannite Church and the restored order of the Temple. So occasionally we call this the Leviticon for short, but more properly it's the Gospels according to the primitive church. And when the legend refers to the Gospels, that's what it's referring to. So in the Gospels, according to the primitive church, this distinction between John and the other apostles is made directly there when Jesus designates John directly as his successor. So it's found both in the legend and in the scripture used by the Johannite Church. So it says that Peter and the other apostles evangelized, but were forced too often to conform themselves to the manners and customs of different nations and admit rites that were not of the East. Quote, shades and differences entered into the Gospels and sects. And here I have to assume that the Gospels refers to the other text as opposed to the Gospels according to the primitive church. So now also when we look at this and we're at this point, in the legend, supplementing that with some of the information, lineage information, and legendary information presented in the commentary in the Leviticon, we note that Theoclete, who is the patriarch who transmits the lineage, spiritual power, and authority of the Johannite Church to the order of the Temple, the Leviticon commentary and tables note that Theoclete himself receives the lineage of the Johannite Church from Eustace in 1099, which of course is the year of the First Crusade. So continue on with the legend. In 1118, the hierarchical order of the initiation of Egypt was transmitted to the Jews by Moses, and afterwards to the Christians by Christ, was preserved by John. And in 1118, it was transmitted to Hugh de Payen, who is described in the legend as Hugh of the Pagans, to Hugh de Payen and his companions by this patriarch Theoclete. Hugh was clothed with the apostolic patriarchal power and placed in the legitimate order of the successors of St. John. And this lineage is documented in the appendix of the Leviticon commentary. So these mysteries and initiations that were a part of the deposit and the transmission were regenerated by the evangelical initiation. So essentially, what the legend is saying is that, as I take it, is that the evangelical initiation, the central thing which Jesus transmits to John, essentially, brings to life or regenerates or gives spiritual force to the mysteries and the initiations themselves, and that these regenerated mysteries and the evangelical initiation were transmitted from the Order of the East and the Johannite Church to Hugh de Payen and the Order of the Temple. So, fusion into the Order of the Temple, the modes of initiation of the Christians of the East, designated under the title of primitive Christians or Johannites. So, the Grand Master Jacques de Molay, aware, according to the legend, of the danger that the order was in, transmitted the Grand Mastership and the apostolic patriarchal power to a Jean-Marc l'Armenius of Palestine. Now, the English translation of the legend has John-Mark l'Armenius of Jerusalem, but we tend to, because of some of the other documentation and commentary on the legend, refers to him as Jean-Marc l'Armenius. Originally, we just keep with that reference with the French. So, l'Armenius in turn transmits both offices in a similar manner to his successor, and this continues on until the era of Bernard-Raymond, fabre-palaprat. In 1804, the Order of the Temple is restored by Palaprat, and he brings the lineage of the Johannite Church and the Order of the Temple to the light of day. Now, the lineage for the two, the Johannite Church and the Order of the Temple, are one and the same, though the Johannite Church restoration doesn't come until sometime later, in about 1812 to 1814, depending on which sources you read. But essentially, at the time of the restoration of the Order of the Temple, that lineage is brought to light, and there is ecclesiastical function that is undertaken in the Order of the Temple. That is to say, Palaprat's Order of the Temple does have priests, bishops, primates, and so on and so forth. There is a church inside the order, but it's not distinctly founded or refounded as such until about 1812, 1814. And this comes with the discovery of the Leviticon and the Gospels according to the primitive church. So, I just want to highlight one portion out of the legend that says, he transmitted his spirit to them, divided them into several orders after the practice of John, the beloved disciple, the apostle of fraternal love, whom he had instituted sovereign pontiff and patriarch. Now, that particular phrasing of that passage actually comes from the institutional narrative in the modern version, which is used in the Apostolic Johannite Church. And after this slide, I'm going to read the version that you hear in our liturgy, or that you would hear in our liturgy if you're able to attend it and haven't been able to attend it. So he transmitted his spirit to them, divided them into several orders after the practice of John, the beloved disciple, the apostle of fraternal love, whom he had instituted sovereign pontiff and patriarch. Now, I had talked earlier about how the legend doesn't specify as such how Jesus divides things up, either according to the custom of the Egyptian and Hebrew priests, or several orders after the practice of John, as found in the text. because this is later on elaborated, not found in the legend, but elaborated on in the commentary in the Leviticon material of Dr. Bernard-Raymond fabre-palaprat. So here we see essentially a degree structure that's found in the order and church of the era. This consists of 9 degrees, grades, or orders. The first being Levite of the exterior guard or chevalier. In plain terms, this is knighthood, being that it's a chivalric order. The second degree being Levite of the parvis. The third degree being Levite of the interior door. The fourth, Levite of the sanctuary. The fifth, Levite of the ceremonies. The sixth, Levite theological. The seventh, Levite deacon. The eighth, Levite priests, also known as doctors of the law. And the ninth being pontiffs or the bishops. Now, one thing that I think that is of note here, besides the fact that the commentary actually elaborates and talks about what these divisions are after the, quote, practice of John, is that this is essentially at once both a church structure in the sense that it replicates a form of the minor orders and the major orders, as found in the historical universal church, and also at the same time a quasi-Masonic or esoteric order degree structure. Essentially, it combines the both of them, which is very much in keeping with the essence of the combined nature of the Order of the Temple and the Johannite Church in the legend. Now that we've broken down and taken a little bit more of a detailed look at the legend that comes directly from the fabre-palaprat era, we're going to actually quickly go over or recount the legend as found in the Mass of the Johannite Church in the present day, so that we can turn around and make some points that kind of compare them side by side. What's different from Palaprat's time to our practice in the present day? What's the same, what's different, and where are they notable? So, without any further delay, the modern Johannite legend as found in the institutional narrative of the Apostolic Johannite Church. Moses was initiated in Egypt, profoundly versed in the physical, theological, and metaphysical mysteries of the priests. He knew how to profit by these so as to surmount the power of the mages and deliver his companions. Aaron, his brother, and the chiefs of the Hebrews became the depositories of this doctrine. The Son of God afterward appeared on the scene of the world. Imbued with the Spirit wholly divine and endowed with the most astounding qualities, he was able to reach all the degrees of Egyptian initiation. On his return to Jerusalem, he presented himself before the chiefs of the synagogue. Jesus Christ, directing the fruit of his lofty meditations towards the universal civilization and the happiness of the world, rent the veil which concealed the truth from the peoples. He preached the love of God, the love of one's neighbor, and equality before the common parent of all humanity. Jesus conferred evangelical initiation on his apostles and disciples. He transmitted his Spirit to them, divided them into several orders after the practice of John, the beloved disciple, the apostle of fraternal love, whom he had instituted, sovereign pontiff and patriarch. The Johannites ascribed to St. John the foundation of their secret church, and the grand pontiffs of the sect assumed the title of Christos, anointed, or consecrated, and have succeeded one another from St. John by an uninterrupted succession of pontifical powers. He who at the period of the foundation of the order of the temple claimed these prerogatives was named Theoclete. In the year 1118, 19 years after the First Crusade had ended, with the defeat of the Muslims and the capture of Antioch and Jerusalem, a band of 9 French gentlemen, led by Hugh de Payens and Godfrey de Saint-Omer, consecrated themselves to religion and took an oath between the hands of the Patriarch of Constantinople, a see always secretly or openly hostile to that of Rome from the time of Photius. The avowed object of the Templars was to protect the Christians who came to visit the holy places. It was in these holy places that the Templars encountered Theoclete, who by the light of undefiled wisdom recognized the courage and piety of these brave men, who with the sword in one hand and the cross in the other, rendered aid and comfort to the Christians of the Holy Land. Theoclete held it his duty to confide to hands so pure the treasures of knowledge acquired throughout so many centuries, sanctified by the cross, the dogma, and the morality of the man-God. Hugh was invested with the apostolic patriarchal power by the sovereign pontiff and patriarch Theoclete, 67th in direct succession from St. John the Apostle, whom he was to succeed. So now that you've heard the legend as presented in the Palaprat era, and you've also heard the institutional narrative of the Apostolic Johannite Church, let's quickly look at some differences here. The chief difference between the full narrative and the liturgical narrative, which is the terms from here on in that I'm going to be using to refer to the Palaprat legend versus the modern AJC legend, the chief difference between the full narrative and the liturgical narrative is Constantinople. Constantinople doesn't appear in the full narrative, but only in the liturgical narrative, and it's where the Crusaders and or Templars take an oath between the hands of the Patriarch of Constantinople. So what you have in this case is it's adding an additional element to the legend or the mission of the Templars after a fashion. Both legends contain the narrative of the transmission of the Johannite Church to the Order of the Temple from Theoclete to Hugh de Payens. And what makes this difference with the addition of Constantinople and the oath between between the hands of the Patriarch of Constantinople is the fact that essentially it adds on a second mission or a second commissioning. So you have a transmission. You have a mission and transmission. Let's say you have a mission and transmission between Theoclete to Hugh de Payens, between the Johannite Church and the Order of the Temple. But in the liturgical narrative, you have that transmission, plus you have an additional ritual, essentially, where the Templars they take an oath between the hands of the Patriarch of Constantinople. So essentially, what you have in those two contrasting, and this goes back to, in my opinion, is a nice tie-in to the esoteric-exoteric split that is mentioned in reference to the full narrative, and also, with my little chatter about two knights on one horse, is that essentially you have an initiatic transmission and you have an exoteric transmission, an inner focused or secret or esoteric ritual, and a public or exoteric ritual. And these two are represented and found in the liturgical narrative, but not found in the full narrative. This, of course, will come out a little bit more as we look at some of the other legends. So here now you're seeing between the two versions of the one legend a key difference develop. The other thing that's important to note is that in the liturgical narrative, it's very similar to versions of the legend that are presented in some Masonic material. Don't quote me on this, but I believe that some recounting of the Johannite legend is found in Mackey's History of Freemasonry and also in Albert Pike's Morals and Dogma. An additional difference found in the liturgical narrative of the modern Johannite Church, but not found in the full narrative of the Palaprat era, is that the sovereign pontiff and patriarch, or the successors of St. John, the successors of Theoclete, the successors of Hugh de Payens, along those lines, are referred to by the title of Christos, anointed, or consecrated. Now, I would tend to think, because the institutional narrative, as we know it, is presumably of a later date than the full narrative of Palaprat's era, that this would be an innovation or some kind of egotistical add-on by somebody further up the chain in the lineage. However, these titles, essentially a version of these titles, is found or referenced in the Table of Pontiffs, which is found in the Leviticon commentary of Palaprat's era. So while not being found in the full narrative of the Palaprat era, it is still found in the Leviticon material, in the commentary and documentation of the Order of the Temple and the Johannite Church, originating from that same era. It's also important to note, to be more specific, that the title that is specifically confirmed by the documentation of the Leviticon is that of Christos, as it refers, starting with John and continuing throughout the lineage of the sovereign pontiffs, as it refers to John as Christos directly in the documentation. Another interesting difference, which might be seen a little bit as splitting hairs, but no one splits hairs quite like religion, is that in the full narrative of the Palaprat era, you have in the text reference to the God-man, when they refer to the morality and the dogmas of the God-man, God-man, or God-man. In the liturgical narrative found in the modern Apostolic Johannite Church, that's switched around for the man-God. Now, some people will say, okay, well, what's the difference? Aren't they talking about the same thing? And you know what? They probably are. But for me, and this is something that seminarians, know all too well, is that when it comes to theology, precision is important. An interesting thing to note to kind of illustrate what the potential difference is that both Eastern Orthodoxy and Roman Catholicism believe in the triune God, essentially that the Godhead is composed of a Trinity. However, when you look at it from the standpoint of their specific theology or their mystical theology, they approach it in slightly different directions. Eastern Orthodoxy tends to describe God as being one in three, whereas the Roman Catholic Church tends to describe God as being three in one. And so now you can see the where one kind of starts at a fundamental unity, and one starts at a fundamental unity that goes into the Trinity, whereas one starts a Trinity that goes into a fundamental unity. That essentially, to a certain degree, it changes the approach to the approach or the language or the symbolism connected to mystical theology. You don't have to take my word for it. I believe there is a section that deals with that distinction in Archbishop Callistos Ware's book, The Orthodox Church, which is found in our seminary reading list. And if you're not a seminarian, it's still a hell of a good book anyway to read, as it gives you a very good breakdown of the history, theology, and practice of the Eastern Orthodox Church. So that's an additional difference. Man-God versus God-man. I'll let you chew on that. I don't have necessarily, an official position, of the church doesn't have a position on that difference. I'm just noting the fact that it's there, and that similar differences, in the arrangement of words when it comes to, theology dealing with the Godhead does have an impact. Okay, so a couple other details, as I've mentioned, the Leviticon material, and the Gospels of the primitive church. Another thing to note, as we've kind of invoked some of that material, in relation to the legend that we've related bits in the Gospels to where they correspond in the legend, is that the specific legend around the Leviticon material, around the Gospels material itself, said to have originated in 1154 by a monk by the name of Nicephorus of Athens. And it's said to be an epigraph, which is essentially a fancy word for exact copy of a 5th century manuscript. It's worth noting that depending on which lineage and which recounting of history in the Grand Masters you look at, that 1154 has either Bertrand de Blanchefort or Andre de Montbar as the Grand Master of the Knights of the Temple at the time. Alternatively, though I can't remember the source off the top of my head, I've seen it, the Leviticon, as being a 15th century copy of an older work. Having looked at the legend as it has been expounded or presented within both the Johannite Church of primitive Christians in the early 19th century and the Apostolic Johannite Church and the institutional narrative in the present day, we're now going to move on to the second set of our set of 3 or 4 organizations that utilize a form of this Johannite legend, or basically the legend that an Order of the East or hidden Johannite church transmitted its spiritual authority, lineage, and powers and mission to the Knights of the Order of the Temple in the medieval era. So, to briefly recap, those organizations are, of course, the Apostolic Johannite Church and the Johannite Church of Primitive Christians. The second set of figures and organizations is that of the Rosicrucian Grand Master Raymond Bernard, and the organizations he founded, Circe and Osti, O-S-T-I, the Sovereign Order of the Initiatic Temple, or Order Souverain du Temple Initiatique, to butcher the French, and the last set being a combination of the Rose Croix d'Orient, the Rose Cross of the East, and the Order Martiniste at Sinarquique, the Martinist Order in Sinarquique. So, taking a look at the second figure here in our list of organizations which utilize this legend, we have Raymond Bernard. Raymond Bernard was born in 1923, and he was a Mason, esotericist, and mystic that would go on to serve as the Grand Master of France and or French-speaking Rosicrucians from the well-known Rosicrucian Order, Amorc, headquartered in the United States. Throughout his career, he wrote several books and participated in several organizations. In his books, the notable ones, at least from the perspective of some of his esoteric history and perspective and the mythology that he worked with, were the Secret Houses of the Rose Croix and a secret meeting in Rome. A secret meeting in Rome would form the kind of basis or introduction or mystical or legendary backdrop to the organizations that he would found, being Circe's and Osti. Those two organizations being linked, Circe's being a preparatory school or a preparatory order, in preparation for a membership in Osti, which is a Templar order. In terms of the Templar order, which is Osti, lineage-wise, it has its roots in the Sovereign Military Order of the Temple of Jerusalem, which itself would be a branch, and actually there are several branches. This is splintered into 3 or 4 major groups, which they would be an eventual branch of fabre-palaprat's Order of the Temple. So lineage-wise, as a Templar order, they extend from fabre-palaprat's Order of the Temple. And whether as a part of that or through some other sources, as there are some key differences, they make use of some of the overarching points found in the Johannite legend that I've recounted so far. So whether or not they got it from the Palaprat legendary material, whether they got it from a separate source, I do not know, because there are some significant differences. So now let's take a look at the bulk of the legend as presented by Raymond Bernard and or his the organizations that he founded, being Circe's and Osti. So I'm going to quote at length from one of their internal documents which recounts this esoteric traditional or legendary history and overlaps with some of the legends that we've looked at before. A much shorter, more narrative, and of course highly dramatized version essentially of this legend is also to be found in his public work, his book being A Secret Meeting in Rome. Though this won't be quoting from here, this will be quoting from initiatic documents. This is the reason why history knows very little of the Brothers of the East, who, as a matter of fact, were the originators of the Order of the Temple. Matters dealing with them have nevertheless been carefully preserved by the oral tradition and are reserved to an extremely small circle of initiates. The supreme see of the Brothers of the East had its headquarters in Constantinople. The order had been created in 1054 in a convent on Mount Olympus. It is there when an envoy from the Order of the Silent Guardians had to meet with Michael Psellos, who we know was a restorer of Plato's philosophy. Michael Psellos stayed there 3 years in a convent. Already well versed in traditional research, he was appointed to accomplish the mission entrusted to him. During these 3 years, he received his initiatic training and was told what to do. His initiator came from nearby Greece, where he lived the life of an ascetic within a Pythagorean community near Athens, before being assigned by the Order of the Silent Guardians to initiate Michael Psellos. In 1057, Michael Psellos returned to Constantinople, where he became an advisor to Isaac I and his successors, and he had an extremely favorable influence in helping them regulate a volatile situation caused by the recessing emperors. But henceforth his real work, that to which he gave himself secretly with great energy and passion, was the constitution of the Order of the Brothers of the East. He was then 39 years of age, and chose those who were to become the first adepts of his order from amongst the circle of Platonist disciples. This later expanded to include those who had come from traditional Kabbalistic and Sufi backgrounds. Michael Psellos died in 1078 at the age of 60. His work was finished, and the order which he was entrusted to create was well established. His successor, aged 32, took the esoteric name of Melchizedek, and a little later on we find him again taking part in the events which led to the formation of the Order of the Temple. The Order of the Brothers of the East consisted of 3 degrees: disciple, adept, and master. Each one was preceded by a lengthy initiation which started always at midnight when the moon was ascending. The training received by the brothers was quite classical from the point of view of the tradition. It involved the dual phase of teaching and experimentation, but in particularly it focused on Pythagorean wisdom, symbolism, gematria, and the theoretical facts of alchemy. However, the order had a very special mission of the greatest importance, and it is this mission which fundamentally justified its existence. It had to promote and encourage by all available means the meeting of East and West on the plane of the established tradition. Its geographical position qualified it as the point of contact between these 2 great civilizations. Symbolically, it is there that the traditional meeting took place, and in fact, it is there that it effectively took birth. It occurred during the First Crusade, at the very moment when, in 1096, Hugh de Payens and Godfrey de Saint-Omer made contact in Constantinople with the Order of the Brothers of the East. Hugh de Payens and Godfrey de Saint-Omer both belonged to the same traditional organization whose ancient origin was the Alexandrian Gnosis, and it is acknowledged by historians that this source, also shared by the mystic Jewish, Muslim, and Druze thinkers, permitted their meeting to occur within the bounds of traditional language despite religious divisions. But the truth goes well beyond what the official history recognizes, for the Alexandrian Gnosis was itself attached to the common source of the primordial tradition. In fact, the organization to which Hugh de Payens and Godfrey de Saint-Omer belonged was created in the 9th century. In the course of his traveling in the East, its founder, whose exoteric name was Amos, had heard of a secret society whose knowledge possessed the keys of all science and art. This society had its headquarters in Egypt, and Amos, properly recommended, went there and was admitted into this society. Studying there for 2 years, he then returned to France with the authorization to create a branch of the organization there. This he did, but its real activities began only 3 years later. The Egyptian source which gave him his initiation and power was the most authentic possible. It was on the Egyptian soil that the principal center of preservation of the tradition, to which all active centers were directly or indirectly attached. These included the Pythagorean community, from which later on an envoy was chosen to meet Michael Psellos. It is also here that the Brothers of the East met after its founding. In those days, Thebes was the center from which the Order of the Silent Guardians operated, and later on the instructions were sent from there to the Pythagorean community near Athens. Much later, the order established by Amos spread to the outside world and took on different names. Hugh de Payens and Godfrey de Saint-Omer also belonged to the order created by Amos. Furthermore, Hugh de Payens' grandfather, Thibaut de Payens, the Mar de Gardil, was a Moorish Sufi who had been initiated into the tradition, and this involvement paved the way for Hugh de Payens' initiation into the order created by Amos. Being levels of the elite, in 1096 they had already achieved important levels within the order. They were not unknown to each other. Each had special responsibilities within the organization where they had met on several occasions and had great mutual sympathy towards each other. When the First Crusade was planned for reasons of exoteric faith and other materialistic reasons, the Order of the Silent Guardians decided to use this means to reunite the Eastern and Western traditions into a single large grouping and to ensure that certain buried artifacts from the Holy Land would be preserved and not destroyed by the Crusaders going there. The Silent Guardians were awaiting the right moment for the unfoldment of the great cycles of knowledge, and the moment had at last arrived. Therefore, the necessary instructions were sent to the French centers from which Godfrey de Bouillon was called into action, and later from which Hugh de Payens and Godfrey de Saint-Omer were chosen to take part in the crusade and under its protection, and to enter into a relationship with the Order of the Brothers of the East, which itself had anticipated this moment. Therefore, everything was in place and outer events were utilized to unify the great work. The encounter at Constantinople took place in 1096, when on the one hand, Hugh de Payens and Godfrey de Saint-Omer, duly mandated, met the great master Melchizedek, surrounded by 4 officers of the Order of the Brothers of the East, at a special church called the Church of St. Sergius and Bacchus, which was later to be called the Little Hagia Sophia Mosque. In fact, it was not just one meeting. They had many, 7 in all, and all at the Church of St. Sergius and Bacchus, and the second of which the meeting was dedicated to the honorary reception of Hugh de Payens and Godfrey de Saint-Omer into the midst of the Order of the Brothers of the East. In turn, Hugh de Payens and Godfrey de Saint-Omer bestowed a high honor upon the Grand Master Melchizedek and his companions in the name of the Order of France. Thus, a traditional exchange was established at the top. The directives received from here and there were extremely flexible. The decision regarding the manner by which traditional exchanges between the West and the East was to be established was left to the meeting of the distinguished assembly. The assembly examined the different ways that could guarantee effective results. The fundamental directive was therefore the creation of a new order which would serve as a link between the two great expressions of the tradition and which could effectively help in the spreading of wisdom. It was also envisioned that this order could act as a means of transporting the sacred artifacts to be reacquired in the secret places of the Holy Land, and to effectively share and acquire other texts being preserved by other orders of the primordial tradition. They were also to serve as a buffer to the problems and violence that would inevitably get out of hand with the Crusades. All of this would work to encourage a real advancement in civilization, with an estimated period of approximately 200 years from the date of 1118 established by the Order of Silent Guardians. It was agreed to define the form which this new order would take and its modes of action. Okay, so that was a lot of reading. So let's take some time here to break down the essentials of what that version of the legend presents. So you have an Order of the East that apparently came into being in 1054 on Mount Olympus. Of course, 1054 is also the year of the Great Schism in actual history, which I noted at the beginning of the talk. So a Michael Selos was initiated by the Order of the Silent Guardians to begin the Order of the East. And of course, this document doesn't elaborate on the history or nature of the Order of the Silent Guardians, so unfortunately I can provide nothing for you there. So the first adepts of the Order of the East were Platonists, and this later was expanded to include Kabbalistic and Sufi initiates. Selos' successor was an initiate by the name of Melchizedek. So cross-referencing some of this stuff found in the Bernard legend and initiatory material, when you look at the lineage that is presented by Circes and Osti, in their lineage, they list Melchizedek as having the ecclesiastical name of Theoclete. So now you see a little bit of a connection between the two legends. So, and apparently this Melchizedek, whose name was Theoclete, ascended to headship of the order in 1077, prior to Michael Selos's death in 1078. This order of the East had 3 degrees: disciple, adept, and master. So Eutypan and Godfrey de Saint-Omer were, in this accounting, initiates of an Egyptian order whose French branch was founded by an initiate named Amos or Amos. Some tellings have this French branch as ultimately being the Order of the Rose Cross. Now, connecting over to some other legends, which we find in Freemasonry, this parent order of the Rose Cross, or that accounting of the Order of the Rose Cross, has it having its parent in an Egyptian order that was said to be ultimately founded by one Ormus, a Serapic priest and disciple of St. Mark, whom St. Mark converted in 96 AD. This order of the Ormasians Christianized the Egyptian mysteries, particularly the mysteries of Isis and Osiris. Now, this myth is found in an accounting of the Masonic Rite of Memphis and also in Mackey's Encyclopedia, talking about the Order of the Rose Cross. More specifically, let me find this here, more specifically in the entry for the Brethren of the Rose Cross of Gold. So, and one thing I wanted to note here, of course, is that St. Mark is said to be the patron of the city of Venice, and it was in a library in Venice where one of the purported copies of the Leviticon was held for some time. So, the Silent Guardians, this Order of the Silent Guardians, going back to the Raymond Bernard legend more directly, the Order of Silent Guardians directed initiates from both east and west towards meeting and work. And Eutypans and Godfrey de Saint-Omer met with Theoclete, known in this legend by the name Melchizedek, but accounted for in their lineage under both names, met with them 7 times in Constantinople in 1096 towards the founding of the Order of the Temple. Initiations were exchanged between the Order of the East and this, well, we're going to call it the Order of the Rose Cross, rather than simply the order founded by Amos. And the intent of this Order of the Temple was to recover relics, be an entity with a public-facing component, and to keep a leash on the Crusaders and unify Western and Eastern traditions. Now, if you're keeping score on on that tally or that esoteric to-do list in terms of recovering relics, be an entity with a public-facing component, leashing Crusaders, and unifying Western and Eastern traditions, I would say that it doesn't score too well. So rather than break down the exact similarities and differences between the two essential legendary accounts that I've presented so far, I'm going to throw a third combined one into the mix and then start looking at the significant similarities and differences after we've done that. So in this third section of versions of the legend, this comes out of organizations that have a lot of overlap in the early 20th century, being the Brothers of the East, the Order of the Lily, the Eagle, and the Order Martinist at Sinnerkeek, the Martinist Order in Sinnerkeek. Now, I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation that one of the sections we would look at would be the Kabbalistic Order of the Rose Cross, but the Kabbalistic Order of the Rose Cross, in terms of some functioning of esoteric orders in the early 20th century, has some overlap with the Martinist Order and the Order of the Lily, of the Eagle, and the Brothers of the East, in the sense that they form, in some parts, either preparatory degrees to these organizations or higher degrees to these organizations. So essentially what I'm doing is I'm taking these all and treating them as one kind of entity or legendary blob to look at this third section of the legend, so to speak. Okay, get a coffee, take a deep breath, and give your head a shake, because this part's going to start to get really confusing if you weren't already confused already, and that could either be the material or me or a combination of the two. So now we're going to look at a couple of these different orders that overlap and connect to each other and use some form of the legend. So the first up to bat in terms of using a version of this legend of the Brothers of the East and connection to Templars would be the Order of the Lily and the Eagle. The Order of the Lily and the Eagle was said to be a continuation of the Rose Cross of the East, with the Rose Cross of the East being included in the degrees of the Lily and the Eagle. This Rose Cross of the East, which I'm now going to call the RCO, save myself any French or awkwardness, even though there's plenty of it, from the start up to this point, the RCO itself being said to be part of the Brothers of the East. So the RCO was said to have been founded in terms of their own legend or historical narrative by the Patriarch of Constantinople in 1054, whom they name as Photius. However, while I haven't stopped to do a lot of historical correction or historical context for some of these legends as we go, this one's pretty glaring, so I'm going to point it out. Photius was not the Patriarch of Constantinople in 1054. In fact, Photius, if it is the Photius I'm thinking of, had been dead for a couple hundred years. That's a pretty significant difference. So the Patriarch at the time was a Michael Cerularius. So an alternate version of the Lily and Eagle legend, and by the way, the Lily and the Eagle specifically refer to St. Mary and St. John. So an alternate version of the legend has the Order of the East as founded in 1090 under the patronage of Emperor Alexius. Some strands of this legend, or accounts that I can find, have the meeting between the Order of the East and the future Templars, in this accounting being Hugh de Payens and Hugh, Count of Champagne, in 1104, with an unnamed Grand Master succeeding to the leadership of the Order of the East after Michael Selos in 1078. So that's the Order of the Lily and the Eagle and the Rose Cross of the East, or RCO, and where they combine with the legend of the Brothers of the East and the Templars. This next bit that I'm going to look at is a summarized form, because I can't give you the direct form, a summarized form of the legend that is found in the material of the Order Martinist at Sinnerkeek, the Martinist Order in Sinnerkeek. And as I noted earlier, at least I hope I noted it earlier, I haven't had enough coffee at the time of publication. Actually, that's pretty universally true. I've just never had enough coffee. That a shorter form of the legend, or abridged form of similar legend, is also used in the traditional Martinist order, which has its connections to Amorg, which, as I've noted before, has its connections to Raymond Bernard. So this central legend here has it that there's an overarching tradition that was perpetuated or rooted in oral teachings transmitted by the Apostle John. This tradition centered around Byzantium, or was at least found itself centered around Byzantium by the 3rd century, later structured and given corporate form by Constantine. I'm going to pause here for a quick second and make a note. So far, I haven't singled this out in previous versions of the legend, and I don't want to pick on the material I'm working with currently, as I think it's true of the versions of the legends that we've looked at so far. But you'll notice when it comes to traditional history and esoteric history, mythological history, whichever form they're using it essentially for, telling a story or a kind of narrative, when it comes to esoteric orders, is that there's a habit of taking central historical figures and making them a part of the story. This does have a scriptural equivalent, which we call the pseudepigrapha, right? Pseudepigraphic works are essentially scriptures that have been given the name of a significant disciple or apostle that probably didn't write the text in order to give it additional authority and weight that it might not have otherwise. So esoteric history essentially does this, through the name dropping and inclusion of significant figures. So in this legend, we have Constantine the Great. Previously in other versions of the legend, of course, we have the Templars themselves, St. John the Apostle, the Emperor Isaac, that kind of thing. So esoteric history is full of this stuff, if you haven't noticed. So back to this legendary summary. This tradition, centered in Byzantium and structured by Constantine, would later be infused with teachings from Iranian, Palestinian, Chaldean, and Jewish traditions. Gradually, this catch-all tradition, this overarching perennial tradition, would be spread over all the Byzantine territories, where eventually it was encountered and adopted by Hugh de Payens. Now, there's also notes that say the Templars also here took refuge in Alexandria and Greece during persecution, that Arab initiates joined the overarching community. Presumably, this connects to the idea in the previous point that the tradition had infusions from Iranian, Palestinian, Chaldean, and Jewish traditions. So the story has it at the fall of Constantinople that this caused a departure towards Asia. However, I've included minor with a question mark because it doesn't actually specify which part of Asia. We can only assume they go east. Branches that went west were responsible in this telling for the traditions of Rosicrucianism and Martinism. So there you have kind of a summary version of the legend that's found in a couple of the Martinist orders. So previously here I've presented a short version of the legend, or the basic quote-unquote facts of the legend as found in the Rose Cross of the East and the Lily of the Eagle, followed by a version of the legend that's presented with the Martinist orders. How do these two connect? Okay, this is the confusing part. So follow me, if you will. The Order Martiniste of Lyon was formed by the successor to Papus, or Papu, depending on how you pronounce it. I butcher it either way, being Tater, and went on to include Masonic requirements for its members. So people who were to be initiated in the Order Martiniste Lyon were required to be Freemasons. The Martinist order and synarchy was founded by initiates that weren't tied to an order, and they were qualified to pass on the teachings and lineages as individuals outside an order system. In Martinism, we call this free initiation, and there's a degree specifically of free initiator. So the OMS was found by free initiators, the first Grand Master being Victor Blanchard, after leaving the Order Martiniste of Lyon due to a disagreement with the Masonic requirements that the Order Martiniste of Lyon required. The Martinist order and synarchy degrees contained elements from several sources. The second degree having its basis in the Knights Beneficent of the Holy City, which was and is a chivalric approach to the teachings of Martinism. And in the third degree of the OMS, where the legend is found, the basis is said to be the material of the Order of the Lily and the Eagle, as previously mentioned. So this is now where these two legends connect, or sources connect, usage connect. The rituals are said to be authored in whole or in part by Demetrius Semilas, who was the founder of the Order of the Lily and the Eagle. So now, essentially, we reach a point where we have looked at four versions of this overarching legend, which in most parts go back to either St. John or Egypt or both. Now that we've looked at four different versions of this common legend, I wanted to explore what are the actual similarities, the significant similarities between them. One of the chief similarities across all versions of the legend is that there is a predecessor lineage or a predecessor organization to the Knights Templar. In the institutional narrative, this takes the form of the Johannite Church. In the legend of Palaprat material, this takes the form of the Order of the East, which is also the Church of St. John in the lineage of St. John. So in that they have in common the lineage of St. John. And of course in the Raymond Bernard material and then in the Martinist material, you also have a form of the Order of the East. Now another thing common to all of them is essentially the legendary context of two initiations or ordinations, one public and one private. That essentially there was an exoteric establishment of the organization and the Templars and the mission, and an esoteric establishment in which the lineage and spiritual authority and so forth of the Church of St. John or the Order of the East was transmitted to them. Now, there is one slight difference between the legendary material of Bernard-Raymond, fabre-palaprat, and the institutional narrative as it is used by the Apostolic Johannite Church in the present day. And that comes in the realm of their public oaths, so to speak. For the AJC in the institutional narrative, this has an oath to the Patriarch of Constantinople, or the text has between the hands of the Patriarch of Constantinople, where afterwards they would go on to receive their initiation or ordination from Theoclete, at least in terms of how the text is written. It's implied that they are events where one follows the other. Now, historically, of course, this presents some problems because, as I mentioned before, while a lot of the initial Templars may have been Crusaders, the Order of the Temple was not a part of the First Crusade. That said, some of the Crusaders, in the form of their leaders, the leaders of the Crusade, such as Godfrey de Bouillon, etc., did take oaths in Constantinople. Significantly, they took an oath to the Emperor of Constantinople that if on crusade they were to capture any territories that used to belong to the Byzantine Emperor and Byzantium, that they would return them. But of course, there's a 20-year difference between the timeline that is implied by the institutional narrative and the actual history. And of course, the other difference is that the oath in the institutional narrative is to the Patriarch of Constantinople rather than the Emperor of Constantinople. Another thing that is important to note, that because it's not specific on the date, it is entirely possible that legendary-wise, they took an oath to the Patriarch of Constantinople closer to 1118. Though why they would leave Jerusalem after being established for Constantinople historically doesn't make a lot of sense as such. So in terms of the actual legend for Bernard-Raymond, fabre-palaprat and the institutional narrative, they have the order essentially that the Knights Templar are publicly established, and then they privately, secretly, or initiatically receive essentially the lineage of the Order of the East and the Johannite Church, and that of St. John the Apostle. Now, in the Raymond Bernard legendary material, that pattern is reversed. Essentially, they receive their initiation, ordination, transmission, whichever you want to call it, first in private from the Order of the East, and then some 2 decades later, they're established publicly in Jerusalem, where they take their regular oaths as per history under Patriarch Raymond, or at least it's assumed. It's not said directly in the text, but it is clear that the private initiation occurs first by the Patriarch Theoclete, who they refer to both in their lineage as Theoclete of the Johannite Church and as Melchizedek of the Order of the East, and this takes place in 1096. So the other thing that they all have in common is that all of these legends go back to Egypt, and this simply could be a product of the time in which these legends arise. Certainly, there is enough overlap or connections between some of the organizations involved where they could be working from very likely working from a common legend. And the most basic part of the common legend is they come back to Egypt, but also at the same point, looking particularly at when the earliest forms of the legend are utilized, which would be the Bernard-Raymond fabre-palaprat material. Egypt was considered the foremost ancient and oldest civilization at the time, to my knowledge. So naturally, anybody who was anybody within the esoteric world would want to have a pedigree for their organization or tradition that goes to the most ancient and august of sources. And around the time of revolutionary France, especially considering some of the discoveries made at that time, that culture, civilization, and country would be Egypt. Okay, so now that we've sat down and looked at some of the similarities between these different accounts of the legend for the Johannite Church, the Order of the East, Theological, and the Knights Templar, let's stay seated and look at some of the differences. So some of the things that jump out to me immediately, and of course you might find other things if you look at the source material or you go back through the material that I've provided, but these are some of the things that jumped out at me. One of the immediate things, of course, is Jerusalem versus Constantinople. In terms of the encounter with Theological and the initiation of the Knights Templar, in some of the legends these take place in the Holy Land, for which I'm putting in for short Jerusalem. And in other legends this takes place in Constantinople. Another one of the significant differences is Constantinople itself. Constantinople is referenced in the majority of the legends, however, in a different fashion or a different function. Some of the legends you have the initiation and transmission of the Johannite lineage or the lineage of the Order of the East, or both, occurring, as mentioned, in Constantinople from Theological to the Knights Templar. In the AJC narrative, however, as you'll recall, the Constantinople is only mentioned in the context of the Patriarch of Constantinople, who takes vows or oaths from the future Knights Templar. Now, it's important to note, or maybe not important, but at least interesting to note from a historical perspective, that oaths were taken in Constantinople by the Crusaders. So, not taken by the Patriarch of Constantinople, but by the Emperor of Constantinople. And of course, these are Crusaders, not necessarily Templars. Some of the Templars, as mentioned earlier, some of the Templars were Crusaders and were a part of the First Crusade, but some but not all. And of course, the Order of the Temple didn't exist at the time of the First Crusade. In history, it only existed that way in some of the myth and legend and stories that we're recounting today. So, some of the Crusaders did, in fact, take oaths in Constantinople, but not all Crusaders. Only the leaders of the First Crusade, and significantly 3 or 4 figures. The one that I was going to highlight here would be Godfrey de Bouillon, who was essentially the leader, the ultimate leader of the First Crusade. And he took an oath, or gave his oath to the Emperor of Constantinople, essentially that the Crusaders would return lands that were property or owned or oversight or ruled by Constantinople historically, that as they conquered these lands that used to be under the reign of Constantinople, that if they conquered these lands, they would return them to Constantinople. And this was essentially their payment for the resources and assistance they needed in terms of getting to the Holy Land, for example. Another significant difference, of course, is the references to Theoclete in terms of when he takes over the Johannite Church or the Order of the East in some of the legendary material in lineages, you have this date being 1077. In others, you have it being 1099. In terms of the major overarching differences between these legends, is that the Apostolic Johannite Church narrative and the Ecclesiastic Johannite, the primitive Christian narrative, that legend ultimately arcs from Egypt to the Temple of Solomon, to the community of the beloved disciple, through the Templars, to the modern era. Whereas the legend found in the Raymond Bernard material, the Lily and the Eagle material, Rose Cross of the Orient, favor an arc from Egypt to the Charlemagne era Europe, to the Templars, to the modern era. And it's interesting to note that some of the legends themselves account for this split in terms of talking about how one portion of the lineage or the tradition comes up through the east, another comes up through the west, and essentially they meet in Constantinople and go forward as one with the order of the temple itself. Having compared the legends side by side to look at their similarities and their differences and the interesting bits that drop out of the middle to learn a little bit more about this medieval Johannite mythos, we're going to take one more stop before we wrap up this short exploration and presentation, and that's to look at the Johannite legend, or the medieval Johannite legend, through the lens of temple theology. Now, I am quite a beginner when it comes to temple theology. I've listened to a few lectures by Dr. Margaret Barker, and of course, I've listened to and been present for many of the lectures given by Bishop Tim Mansfield, and I've had several discussions with him on it, and also with the Reverend Mr. Jonathan Stewart on temple theology. However, I am not very versed in it. I am versed enough really to read and explore some of the ideas, but not to present temple theology as a whole in any detail to you. So I'm not going to do that here, and I'm going to suggest that you look at some of the resources we have in which we've already explored temple theology, namely the presentation and writings of Bishop Tim Mansfield, and of course the main proponent of temple theology itself, Dr. Margaret Barker. What I am going to do, though, is assume that you've done some of that and look at a couple points in the Johannite mythos, medieval and ancient, or at least claimed medieval and ancient, and look at the bits related to the temple that jump out at me. Before we get into temple theology and its potential connections to the Johannite mythos, I wanted to stop and make an important note. As you can see from the slide, this important note is going to be on something called supersessionism. Now, temple theology, to treat it very briefly in one sentence or two, and thus to do it very little justice, a 1 or 2 sentence summary of temple theology is essentially that temple theology is the idea that early Christian liturgy is the continuation or restoration of first temple practice, that is the Temple of Solomon. So you can see how this connects to a lot of our legends. So now, one of the reasons why I think it's important to stop and make a note about supersessionism is to stress that supersessionism is not what we're talking about here. Supersessionism is an idea that is found, though the name isn't used, to my knowledge, until the modern era. But supersessionism is an idea that's found throughout Christianity in one form or another, and continued to be practiced, if such a thing can be said, or espoused by some denominations in the present day. Supersessionism, also called replacement theology or fulfillment theology, is the idea that the Christian covenant, the new covenant found in the New Testament, is essentially a replacement for, or a fulfillment of, or superior to the old Mosaic covenant or the Jewish covenant found in the Old Testament, and that essentially the Christian church and the Christian people as a spiritual group are now the new chosen people of God. That essentially the status as chosen people of God transfers somehow from the Jewish people to Christians of all ages and times. This is not what we're talking about here when we talk about temple theology and the influences and restoration of temple practice potentially on early Christianity. The idea behind temple theology isn't suddenly that magically the Jewish people or Judaism ceases to be relevant or is old or is done away with. Far from it. I think Christianity, particularly Gnosticism, and of course esotericism, owes the Jewish people and Judaism a great debt, spiritually and historically. So I wanted to make a note before we get into where First Temple practice and temple theology, as espoused by its main proponent, Margaret Barker, affects the Johannite tradition. I wanted to make sure that we're clear that we're saying, in the context of the temple theology hypothesis and the Johannite mythos, that we are not espousing the idea that somehow Christianity has now superseded or done away with Judaism, because that, frankly, is just crap. Okay, here we go. Looking at the Johannite mythos and temple theology, or essentially first temple elements that pop up or are reflected in the Johannite mythos, both the medieval Johannite mythos, possible ancient Johannite speculations, and the Johannite Church in the modern era. So, speculations and connections. From the gospel texts, John the Baptist and the Apostle John both have a connection to the temple, to temple practice, temple lineage. Both the Baptist parents are descendants of Aaron, and John the Baptist's father is a priest. The Levites are the priestly and the temple tribe, as mentioned in the Old Testament. And in the modern era of the Johannite Church, with Bernard-raymond, fabre-palaprat, the Johannite Church's orders, their holy orders, all of them are centered around or classed or named as Levites, and have Levite as a qualifier to each order. And you can find this in the Église Johannite section of the legend analysis that I mentioned earlier. Now, Barker says that the Second Temple is a corruption of temple practice, and essentially the Johannite legend claims to restore the true priesthood, which of course got me thinking, even the name Leviticon, is it possible that it breaks down? And of course, this is very stretchy. I'm not an expert. I'm not even an amateur when it comes to languages, so this could be complete crap. But the idea did pop up to me that the idea or the name Leviticon itself essentially could be a combination of Levite and icon. Icon, of course, meaning true image in Greek, and Levite referring to the priesthood tribe. Looked at in this light, of course, when you look at the Johannite legend, particularly of Bernard-raymond, fabre-palaprat, the manual and the palaprat material, the Johannite legend is essentially claiming to restore the true priesthood or the Levites. Another interesting thing when analyzing the documents and doctrine of the Johannite Church of the Palaprat area is essentially they use a Jewish calendar, lunar calendar, essentially. But they use a Jewish calendar in many of their documents, catechisms, and official datings. Now, looking at the legend and the comments, the Johannite legend and the comments by Barker on the high priest is that when you have First Temple practice essentially corrupted in the time of the Second Temple, that the high priest lacked the anointing found in the First Temple, and in the Johannite legend and the Palaprat material, the sovereign pontiff bears the title of anointed, which can be seen as an allusion to a type of restoration. Speaking of titles, in Barker, Melchizedek is given as the title of the priests/priest kings. In the Johannite legend, Patriarch Theoclete of the Johannite Church is identified in one form of the legend as Melchizedek of the Order of the East. Father Raymond Brown, and for stuff on the Brown hypothesis and community of beloved disciple, see my much earlier talk on the Johannite tradition, part 1. We have the early community of the beloved disciple, and that essentially it receives an influx of adherents who are anti-temple. Now, in the context of temple theology and the idea of the Second Temple being a corruption, through this lens, there might be the possibility that this influx of adherents who are anti-temple are not actually anti-temple, the First Temple, but are essentially anti-Second Temple. Specifically Samaritans who claim to preserve true worship as they remained in the Holy Land during the Babylonian exile. The second group of adherents, which also included Greeks, are responsible for the high Christology found in the community of the beloved disciple and, of course, reflected in the first chapter of the Gospel of John. Now, the Eucharist, it should be noted from the works of Father Brown, in the community of the beloved disciple is not a memorial but a real presence, both from the standpoint of flesh and blood and incarnation, and what Ignatius calls the medicine of immortality, and that essentially these connect to the restoration of the covenant and healing. And this is an idea that is found in Margaret Barker's Temple Theology, specifically the maintenance of the covenant. Both Margaret Barker and the legend propose that Jesus received learning in Egypt, and it's worth noting that there are records and evidence for two Jewish temples being in Egypt, one being in Elephatine and the other being in Leontopolis, which I'm sure I'm butchering those names. Finally and lastly, we have the really stretchy connections, which is basically the equivalent of my brain barf. I mention them here as a matter of course, but these were simply top-of-the-head things at the time without a whole lot of digging. In St. Bernard of Clairvaux's work in Praise of the New Knighthood, essentially where he writes in support of the Knights Templar, he refers to the Templars as the valiant men of Israel and true Israelites. And in the papal bull Omne Datum Optimum, Pope Innocent II refers to the Templars as true Israelites. So that's the really stretchy connections, but between that and the previous two slides of connections, you can see some of the ideas where, or essentially some of the points where First Temple practice or ancient Judaism intersects with the Johannite mythos, particularly the Johannite mythos as it was seen in the Palaprat era. Well, congratulations, you have made it to the end of my long and meandering talk. I hope you've enjoyed the presentation of the different legends and coming with me on a short journey, or not so short journey, as we examine some of the similarities and the differences between the legends, and of course some look at concrete Templar and medieval history, and of course all the legend and mythological history, and some a brief look, however, at temple theology and where it potentially intersects with this whole overarching mythos. So congratulations, you've made it to the end, and the only thing left to do at the end, of course, is to talk about some of my sources, so that if you like, you can dig in and look at some of these things and say to yourself, wow, Shaun McCann is completely full of crap. Or you can dig in and find your own connections and explorations of the different legends and mythos found in the Johannite Church in the modern era. So, sources. Of course, we have the Leviticon. We also have the Manual of the Knights of the Order of the Temple. Of course, we reference the legend, an institutional narrative found in the Sacramentary of the Apostolic Johannite Church, an alternative and more critical form of the legend found in Albert Pike's Morals and Dogma. We have the Liturgy of the Holy Sepulchre of Jerusalem, with special reference to the practice of the Orders of the Temple and St. John of Jerusalem, which is the research that looks at the Liturgy of the Holy Sepulchre and the religious practice of the Knights Templar in actual, concrete, proven history in the medieval era. We have some internal and private documents from the Sovereign Order of the Initiatic Temple, which I was fortunate to get my hands on, and we have the Mystic and Superior Econo degrees of the Order Martiniste at Sinarkeek, the publicly available Manifestations of the Martinist Order by Milko Bogard, and thankfully a very coherent Knights Templar timeline put together by one A.A. Grisham. So I hope you have enjoyed this talk and the examination of the medieval Johannite mythos. And I think even though there is no historical or concrete evidence for a medieval Johannite church, I think the medieval Johannite legend, of course, tells us a lot about the evolution of our own spirituality as Johannites, and of course the evolution from ancient to modern and the ideas of the community of the beloved disciple. So thank you for playing along, following along, and I wish you well in your spiritual practice and, of course, in your research. God bless.